Great. Good morning again. And welcome to the main keynote and grand rounds portion of our kind of Science of Cognitive Training Day. This is our usual grand rounds time for the Department of Psychiatry. So in addition to people attending the conference, we have members of the department who are coming in to hear the grand rounds portion. We will, after Mike's talk, which will be for an hour, we're going to have one final shorter presentation as part of the cognitive training conference schedule by Sean Green on some recent consensus on methods for doing cognitive training studies. And in between those two, members of the department who are not attending the conference and have other duties to attend to, please feel free to get up and leave quietly. But we'll continue on with our program, which will then take a lunch break at 12:30. So this is another one of those moments where I get to express my deep delight and deep pleasure in being able to host Dr. Michael Merzenich here as our distinguished visiting lecturer for our grand rounds in the Department of Psychiatry today, but also presenting as one of our keynote speakers for our day on cognitive training, the science of cognitive training. And I think it's very safe to say that we wouldn't be sitting here in the auditorium all together today if it wasn't for Mike's lifelong contributions as a pioneer in this field of research, beginning as a basic scientist and now in the last over a decade moving that basic science into the world of interventions for humans. And he's going to be talking about that, so I'm not going to dwell too long on that, nor am I going to dwell too long on Mike's many accomplishments. He's one of the founding fathers and one of the I don't know how do you say, the eminences in this field of plasticity research. 2016, he received the Kavli Prize from the Norwegian Academy of Science, which is essentially a Nobel Prize for this work in neuroscience. So it's a real honor to have Mike here. I'm going to just say on a personal note that I wouldn't be here as a department chair of psychiatry here at the University of Minnesota if it wasn't for my collaborative work with Mike. I like to say that he taught me everything that I know, really got me launched on a program of research which has been incredibly fulfilling and exciting, but also taught me through carefully learning to understand what I call Merzenich speak, which you will all be exposed to shortly, learning to think about how neural systems might go awry in psychiatric illnesses and how we might be able to understand what's going awry and then think about developing novel approaches to treatment. So with that introduction, I'd like to turn it over to you, Mike, to speak about rethinking psychiatry from a neuroplasticity point of view.
Thank you, Sophia. It's a delight to be here. I want to say that I had a wonderful day yesterday talking to members of the faculty and a number of young and not quite so young people yesterday, and it was a fabulous day. And I realized in talking to them that this talk would be a little bit of an example of preaching to the choir, or maybe from another perspective, carrying coals to Newcastle. So, probably most of you already got a certain level of the religion I'm going to try to tell you should adopt. But nonetheless, I have to charge ahead because I have no choice. I submitted my lecture a while ago. The second thing I want to say is that you all know that the research I'm going to talk about is team science. If I had set off in science and done these things on my own, it wouldn't amount to a pinch of, feces. And so this is all team science, and you should always understand that there's almost always a younger person, another person's name, in front of any article that I've ever been on in the last 30 years, and that person should be given primary credit and not me. And if you have a question about it, you should go to them first and ask them about it and not me. They're going to be easier to get hold of anyway. And And then lastly, I want to say that I am commercially contaminated. So you should understand that I profit. I was allowed by the University of California to found 2 companies. It was a tremendous privilege that they allowed me to do that, not throw me out. And I do profit by what those companies do. I hold shares, and I've been involved in the operations of these companies. One is Scientific Learning Corporation, which is headquartered in Oakland, California. And the other is Posit Science Corporation, where I currently have an office, and I go every day in San Francisco. So remember that, because a little bit later, some of what I'm saying is going to sound off and on like a commercial. I don't mean that to be so. It's just that I've spent a lot of time with the colleagues that I work with to try to develop strategies that would be useful to help people. And of course, I'm going to be talking about them as if they're the best thing ever that ever came down the road. But understand that at that point, you should be suspicious. So, not too many years ago, we believed the brain was hardware, or let's say the predominant belief was. There were always people in the psychology domain, the physiological psychologists, that knew better. But in general, in the mainstream, in neuroscience and in neurological medicine and in education and other areas, the belief, predominant belief was that the brain was hardwired at a relatively young age. And from the time you went to school or before you went to school, basically, the brain only had one thing it could do, and that's go downhill. It was done. It was then fully developed. It was like the computer on your desk. Its connections were permanent and fixed. They could be reduced, but they could not be substantially remodeled. And of course, we now know that nothing could be further from the truth. The brain actually is creating you in all of your wonderful operational detail, not on the first level, that you inherit the sort of crudest first level organization and functionality, but in every detail and everything you're proud of that you do, and everything that's really important to you that you do, and all of its refinement, that's created by your engagement in the world. And your model of the world itself is created within you through quadrillions of moments of change in your brain in your lifetime. So that's a really important thing, to have this correction in our understanding. And I want to talk a little bit about, in general terms, what it means to have made that correction. Because for whatever reason, it has not been fully absorbed by the wider community of medicine, science, and society in general. And probably I think that there's almost nothing more important that's happened to us in this century than understand that we are a creation, a self-creation, or you could say, to clarify, because there have always been people that believe this or held this position in philosophy and in other places, but to understand that in fact you are a self-creation within your brain, within your lifetime, and that you are all a continuous work in progress, changes everything. This is the point I want to make about how we should think about ourselves and how we've organized our societies and our medicine. So we now know that brain plasticity basically is creating the operational person that you are. And this is very much a function of your individual history. And really a remarkable thing about it is that it's so complicated. It's based upon, in every one of our trajectories through life, both our external experiences and our internal operations are incredibly complicated and individuated. And the product of this, of course, because this is generating changes in our physical brain, it's actually changing the physical machinery, it's localizing our brains, you could say, to us. In detail, you have a brain that's unlike any other that ever was or ever will be. And what a gift that is. That you have the power, that across your early life, a unique machine was created within your skull. And you have the power, once you realize you have it, to exploit this. You could say, to adapt the machine, to create, you could say, a more and more marvelous machine if you choose to. You could just understand how you would go about doing that. I might say that we know that you can acquire a new skill or ability at any point in life. This woman at the right is weaving a basket, and we know that you can improve an ability like this or even acquire one. And we also know that improvement of a skill or ability is, in fact, is a product of brain change. She's actually modifying her brain, adapting it in ways that empower that skill and ability. And that's another way of saying, of course, we know we can do this at any point in life. This is the brain's big trick. It's in there for life. As long as you're alive, you have the capacity to drive changes that could be potentially beneficial or potentially harmful to you operationally. I'd like to briefly consider a few important dimensions of this rapidly evolving science. It'll be very superficial, but I'd like to explain how the science supports a transformative medical and personal model for managing brain health. I like to describe strategies that you can deploy that appear to provide a general basis for calibrating and individuals' health profile. And we've had no real brain health medicine. You go to the doctor says, "How you doing?" You say, "I think I'm doing okay." You just had your annual brain exam, right? I mean, there is no brain medicine. A psychiatrist waits until somebody absolutely is in a desperate state, and they say, you have write down the name. Now you're treatable. A neurologist waits for the person who comes in, maybe dribbling at the mouth or totally unable to take care of themselves, and says, well, now finally you've crossed the threshold. Now you have this desperate condition. You better get ready for the home, right? We have no real medicine. Obviously, in every other domain, we're continually monitoring health. And on some level, we're checking health and we're saying, you have weakness. And this weakness should be expressed by you doing something. Maybe you should change your lifestyle. Maybe you should begin taking this mild form of medicine to try to re-strengthen you, to increase your resilience, to increase your health. Now, wouldn't it be a fabulous thing if we really took on the business of managing brain health? Of regularly checking it up, looking into that machine in the head? It's really a weird thing, you could say, that if we have a brain and we're not obviously very ill, we assume this machine, this organ is healthy. That's a very curious, a very strange way to think about an organ in our body. And then finally, I'd like to briefly describe how brain science informs us about the neurological basis of a life that more reliably sustains an organically healthy brain. So what is changing exactly as the brain remodels itself throughout life? And earlier, Michael Kilgard, what a fabulous class of research he's doing. I mean, I just love it. I just wish he'd go faster. Yeah, and do more. If he just had more rats in training, he could go a lot faster. I don't know. Anyway, and I want to make a point, because he talked about the fundamental thing he's trying to drive is changes in connectivity. But there's a lot more to plasticity than changes in connectivity. That's a point I want to make. He knows that, of course. You're revising the detailed wirings, synaptic connections, but you're also changing many other physical aspects of the information processing machine and the supporting machinery in the brain when you engage it. And you're specializing its operational characteristics that govern its perceptions, attention, cognition, social behavior. And you're advancing the machinery that's actually controlling change. So the machinery that's actually regulating, controlling plasticity, that's enabling it, that's shaping it, is itself plastic. And it's also, so it's critical that you think about, especially when you begin to think about pathology, the ways in which it can be distorted. And these changes are physical. This is not some behavioral, weird thing. This is physical. This is physical neurology. And of course, the product of all of that is the creation of a unique person. So every time you acquire a skill or ability, we know that you remodel the brain in ways that account for the ability. So you can look down at the brain as someone that's learned to read. Here's a young boy that's acquired this ability through many hundreds of hours of practice. And reading involves an association between the sound parts of words that bear meaning and little visual symbol representations of those sound parts, and ultimately drinking them in at high speed, ultimately racing across the written script, and interpreting that oral speech in these visual translational representational terms. And we look at the brain of somebody that has this ability. It's in the top. This is an index of 20 children from a study that's 15, 16 years old, conducted at Stanford. Elise Temple was the leader of this research. You see activity, areas of activity. You can count 6 or 7 in such a brain. And those areas of activity can be assigned different specific roles, or you could say they represent where specific actions are occurring in the act of reading This more posterior area is actually the area we know where the fundamental translation between sound and letter representation is occurring. We know that when you first learn to read, the activity is primarily expressed below here as you're making these letter-sound associations. And then over a period of 2 or 3 or 4 months, as the kid is getting better and better at making these associations, it moves up into the circle. This more anterior area is an area in which there's a very high correlation in a series of studies over 0.8 between the written script and its meaning. So these are critical areas. I've just decided to highlight 2 of several critical areas in this complex task. And if you look at kids of the same age matched that can't read, you can see they have no activities, of course. And it turns out that's relatively easy to train children that are in this boat so that they acquire a reading brain. So it turns out that this is 20 children, and when they were trained over a period of about 20 hours, it turns out that 18 of those children acquired the ability to read at grade level within a short period afterward. And if you look immediately after training, you can see they're beginning to make this sound-letter association. And we know that 2 or 3 months later, they'll have activity right up in the circle, just like these children. And if you can already see that they're beginning to activate this area in which there's provides ongoing basis of translation of the written word for its meaning. So, relatively easy to train the brain to be a reading brain. None of this training has involved reading. The way the children have been trained is as listeners, because it turns out that the primary problem that most struggling readers have in acquiring reading is in the translation, the accurate representation of the details of the sound parts of words. And because they haven't evolved the auditory, the acoustic representation of the sound parts of words in detail at speed, because they're not represented in the normal way, the translation, which is dependent upon that normal representational schema, makes no sense. So reading is frustrated. For them, reading by phonics just makes no sense. You have to correct the listening abilities of the child in order to enable the reading to be successfully achieved. That's another way of saying that when you think about any deficit that relates to any brain in front of you that you're trying to help, you need to understand not just on the behavioral way. The instinctive thing is to train the child and say, read more intensely, try harder. Just like the instinctive say, if I'm depressed, is say, don't be so damn depressed, right? But underneath in the brain is distorted neurology. And understanding the nature of the distorted neurology informs you about what you need to approach to correct. And there's a massive amount of literature now in almost every human or neurological and psychiatric condition that informs us about how to look, how to understand what it is that we need to correct. Not commonly the thing that is most immediately in front of our nose, but other things that relate to foundation skills or abilities that must be corrected to enable more complex things to occur. We've trained more than 7 million struggling school-age children using these strategies, and most are now successful readers. Now, plasticity is also creating something else, of course. It's also creating yourself, and it's doing this by a massive schedule of self-reference. And the self-reference occurs because every time you feel and every time you think and every time you act, the brain is associating that with the source. The source is you. The brain is an associative machine. Its plasticity is substantially based on these temporal associations. And millions of times a year, it's associating you with what's happening in your brain and its activities. And it's actually creating a series of these constructs. So it's basically, because you're heavily engaged on the surfaces of your body, it's associating all that contact in a way that generates the embodied self. You know that you, in a sense, come to the limits of your skin. If you think about where you yourself are as an observer of the world, you'd locate yourself behind your eyes. Because in this case, the self-reference is to yourself as a seer, and so forth. You create 6 or 7 of these constructs. And they're reliably created on the basis of these temporally based associations. Of course, there's about 8.5 currently living variations of this. Isn't that wonderful? And because none of them are exactly identical, and that U is also rapidly extended beyond you yourself, you could say, to anything around you that's really important and occurs with any significant schedule. This process of association with you as the center or the operator is built to attach you to other things that are close to you. When all goes well, you do that richly, not just to other people, of course, but to your tavern if you live in Minnesota, or to your cow if you're a farmer, or to a lot of other things that might be in your environment that are important to you, like the Republican Party, or maybe the Democratic Party, sort of mixed in Minnesota. Very confusing. So our understanding of these processes of continuous brain remodeling actually change everything. I just want to stop a minute and just say this. It informs us about how to think about, classical and modern philosophical perspectives about the true nature of our humanity. Because it's explained in here on a level. We don't really, I think, need more than that. Many people do need more than that. But I'm saying from the point of view of a first level explanation of what we are and why we do what we do, it seems to be explained by how we create ourselves by virtue of these complex processes within our lifetimes. It informs psychology's perspective about the laws that govern human behavior, because they're neurological laws. Now, they may be difficult to reconstruct until our reconstruction of models from these neurological principles and systems become more and more sophisticated, and we could say the true learning theory is this brain theory. But in fact, the true rules and laws do reside and are explained by neurological processes. They're not floating in the air as some mental construct. Our scientific and medical views of the origins of neurodegenerative diseases, because there aren't any, they're fiction, in my mind. They're expected catastrophic end states of where we expect the brain to go when certain bad things happen. By and large, we can argue with my wonderful friend Etienne Villers-Sedani about this, and he would gladly correct me on this, but he shut up for now. Our medical view of the origins and treatments of psychiatric illness, again, these are end states of generally long progressions, weakness, growing weakness, ultimately ending, or maybe some traumatic event that drives a distortion that we just can't get past. But these are presumably expressed as a consequence of progressive plastic changes. Our criminal justice system view the origins of addiction or criminal offending or rehabilitation. We have such an archaic view of this. As soon as we understand that the origins of this do substantially, as many people have understood, really, but now have scientifically validated that they lie in brains that are distorted, largely as a consequence of either what early life has been for them, which is generally terrible, full of neglect or abuse or trauma, or because they've been whacked on the head. Neither one of them is exactly a source of immediate blame. We have a very distorted notion about how we should think about such behavior and how we should think about it societally, because as soon as we know that plasticity is in play and represents a primary causative role, then our moral position should be to help. It should be to fix them. It should be to stop them from having to move forward as a 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 10-year-old child to a disastrous life that ends in such a way. The internist, neurologist, psychiatrist perspective about managing brain health, let's evolve a brain medicine, for God's sakes. How long is it going to take? Our social political view about the origins of personal success and failure. We like to see there are people among us that are really big successes and other people that are really not doing very well. Come on. And our understanding of how neurological limitations are collectively driving us into the ditch. This is a subject of a separate lecture. And we don't want to get into it now. It's just too damn depressing. Okay. So we and others have tried to use this science to help individuals with a variety of conditions. And you could say this is because we're sort of like Mike Kilgard, we just can't stop. And one of those is neurological losses associated with normal and pathological aging. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And really what we're trying to do is primarily prevent, but also in some ways treat dementia, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, other conditions like this. Brain changes that underlie psychiatric illness. And I should say, most of this research, almost all of this research, has been done, in fact, led by people like Sophia, and which we've just tried to help them basically evaluate strategies and hopefully slowly evolve strategies that can be effective and widely applied in the world. Neurological changes underlying opiate or alcohol addiction. Neurological distortions arising from high-stress childhoods. Before I die, if we cannot generate a scalable strategy to go into the world so that everywhere in the world there can be a way in which children can be discovered who have terrible traumatic childhoods and fix them, then you all are entitled to laugh at my grave if you were. Of course, you won't be there, but I'd be ashamed of myself. Childhood impairments that frustrate success in life. Neurological losses associated with brain poisoning or infections or diffuse brain injuries, or inherited neurological disorders or traumatic brain injuries and stroke, or demanding professional or personal life challenges. So all of these things are within the realm of what we're trying to help people with. So I want to talk about a key aspect of this, the underlying phenomenology in very simplistic terms. And I'm really going to be talking about research that was largely led by Etienne de Villers-Sidani, who is at Montreal Neurological Institute, and Jyoti Mishra, who you've just met, a wonderful collaborator who's now, of course, at UC San Diego, and by Zhoming Zhao, who's at the East China Normal University in Shanghai. And I'm going to talk about experiments that demonstrate that plasticity is broadly involving reversible processes. They can be driven in a positive direction or a negative direction, you could say, at will. And that's a really important thing to understand. Now, our studies began initially, we've done this experiment in a piecemeal way in young brains that have been basically compromised early in life. And then we've tried to see if we could repair those brains at an older age in life. And we've done the same class of experiments in that population, but in a much less complete way. But our primary model has been on looking at brains that are really struggling toward the end of life, comparing them in a rich variety of ways with brains that are in the prime of life. And our initial model was the rat, but we've been trying to understand how the phenomenology that's recorded in the rat also relates to or applies for phenomenology that we can record in humans. So we're looking at a rat that's very old and a rat that's in the prime of life, and we're trying to distinguish, you could say, difference in the brain that would apply for the rat. And first thing that Etienne did was simply make a list of 17 things, physical, chemical, functional things that we could relatively easily measure. And the first question he asked was, how many of these 17 things differ in a rat near the end of life from the rat in the prime of life? And the answer is everything differs. Everything you look at differs. Followed by the question, well, how many of these things advantage the older brain? Well, it's really doesn't seem anything that advantages the older brain. Older brains are slower, more sluggish, less reliable, less physically intact in every way that was measured. And then the third question was to involve engaging those older individuals in potentially brain health relevant forms of training to see how complex that training would have to be to drive the brain correctively. And a simple question you could ask from that is, I have this list of 17 physical, functional, chemical things. I'm going to just say a little bit about what those are in a minute. And how many of those things and how complicated would the training have to be to get most or maybe all of those things driven back in the corrective direction? It turns out that all of them are reversible. Turns out everything that is looked at is reversible. Every weakness can be carried back to the performance abilities, to the physical status that's not so far away from, if not all the way back, to the status that's recorded in the brain at the prime of life. I might say that Etienne needed to have assistance later in these experiments, actually from Jody Mishra, or you could say this involved into a collaboration in the studies that she described, in which she extended these experiments immediately in the second class of training into the human brain. So Etienne demonstrated that a second class of training was required in order to complete the circle. So 2 classes of training. Now you could say, well, what were those 2 classes of training? It's amazing that I can talk this long without talking about what's changing. Wow, this is really a boring talk. Anyway, first is you could say, contributed to improvement of the resolution of information in the bottom of brain systems. You could say improvement of the processing in detail, in time, and in frequency, or time and in place. And the second involved improving the resolution, you could say, in the top of the brain, holding information in memory, and improving your ability to hold it in refinement against increasingly disruptive distractors. And I think the ideal would be to do both of these things under conditions in which the brain is speed challenged. You want the brain to be operating with high accuracy at speed, you could say, at every level of its operations. And we heard a talk, beautiful talk by Dr. Schachter about the trade-off between speed and, you could say, and versatility. But the most powerful brain is a brain that's both adaptive, that is to say versatile, at speed. That's the ideal. That's what you really want. You want a brain that can make fast decisions with rich variety of alternatives. And that's a brain, in a sense, that's operating with a very high degree of local correlation at every level in every operation. It really has this information resolved in high detail, so it's a powerful operator in every associative action. So here are some of the things that we looked at, and I might say we've extended this list by other experiments, and other people have also done experiments using tasks that are close enough so that we can say we know these things would also change, and that allows us to raise our list of things we know are altered by training like this up to 25 or 26 at least. We looked at myelin basic protein, and then myelin basic protein basically is back to something close to the young brain states. We see a similar distribution and expression of remyelination. The brain is remyelinating when you train it in these ways. We know from other studies that there's dendritic and axonal arbor branching occurring when you train in these kind of ways. We know that's re-elaborating. We know that from our studies, there were lining studies and other studies he conducted in his own laboratory, that there are inhibitory neuron numbers and morphology changing. He's looked in his own laboratory at somatostatin neurons. In the initial experiment, we looked at parabutyl neurons. They're in poor shape in an old brain, and then restored to a much healthier and much more numerous, close to the numbers. If the dosing was right, you could probably match the numbers recorded in the young brain in the prime of life. We see a recovery from other experiments that we've done in many column sizes and boundaries and representational orderliness. We see changes in trophic factor expression, receptor and subunit constituencies, auditory neurotransmitters, neurotransmitter transporters. Blood-brain barrier integrity is a wonderful class of experiments that Etienne is now pursuing. And I raise this, though it's somewhat little premature, because it is so damned important from the point of view of issues of brain health. Microglial-based immune response, norepinephrine expression, astroglial branching, reactive hyperemia, small vessel elaboration, processing speed, sequential processing, response power and reliability, complex feature representation, system connectivity, feed-forward power. You look at a whole series of things, and they all change positively when you train the brain in a couple simple ways. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that for whatever reason, there's a coordinated change in gene expression for hundreds of genes, and it must be coordinated. Everything is changing together. Or you could say, how many things would I have to look at and see that I have a hit on everything I look at before I decide that everything is changing? It looks like everything is changing in you could say a growthward or a positive change, a blasting direction. So it's if I've thrown a switch in the brain, and I've thrown the chip from a progression of decline. The brain has been changing for a long time. It's going into the tank progressively. And now I've thrown the switch and I've driven everything back that we measure in a positive direction. That strongly smells like or leads to the conclusion that the brain is broadly designed to be reversibly plastic. So it's not a case in which and essentially from the point of view of these issues of brain health, you need to train everything individually. You don't have to think about making all of those little corrections. If the training is in the right form, a whole host of things change in a way that you would interpret as a basis of improvement of brain health. Because all of these changes, moving in a plastic direction, are, you could say, in a healthward direction. Now note that they include things that relate to the vasculature, or the neuroimmune integrity, or the modulatory control machinery of the brain. It's modulating a whole series of processes that relate to brain health and its regulation. So here's a few examples. We're looking down at new myelin formation, myelin basic protein. And you can see that in an old brain, there's quite a bit of new myelin forming and not too much in an old brain. And in an old trained brain, there's more. And again, we think that if you change the dosing, you probably could almost certainly could grow more. You could say you could come closer to this if we did just the best or right thing or enough of it. Here's a little closer view. You can just see a lot of new myelin forming across the cerebral cortical mantle in the areas that we're engaging. You can see not very much in the old brain. And you can see more in the brain that's trained and so forth. Here's a example of the ongoing experiments that Etienne is doing on blood-brain barrier integrity. I'm showing this presumptively because it's his research, of course, and I had nothing to do with it. Or I might say any of these other experiments except hang around in my office saying go faster. And here he's just looking at the leakage from a capillary. And this is typical, and leaking of this marker would be indicated by this diffuse color in the surround. And this is typically what you might see around a small vessel in the old brain. There's a lot of leaking of the tissues of the blood into the brain. This is a signature deficit that's occurring in aging. We know that's associated with the migration of infectious species. For example, viruses from the blood compartment into the brain compartment. We know that it increases the noisiness in the brain compartment because there's an incompatibility of brain fluids with blood fluids with brain fluids. It increases the excitability, increases the noisiness in the brain. You want to have the brain go to hell in a fast rate, then generate leak between the blood compartment and the brain compartment. And when viruses leak into the brain has a protective strategy. It coats the viruses with crystallized amyloid, thereby forming an amyloid body, which is a little poison pill that it drops into the brain. Everything around it is now deactivated. So this is on the path to deactivation, you could say, in the brain into Alzheimer's disease. You train the brain in an old animal, and in this preliminary outcome, Etienne sees that the barrier is resealed. And we think that the barrier is almost certainly plastic bidirectionally, that we can open it at will and we can close it at will. But a whole variety of neurological conditions and psychiatric conditions, it is open in places that contribute to the destruction and the pathology. And that you don't think about fixing this, you think about fixing wiring or fixing behavior. But I use this point, and one reason I picked this out is you need to think beyond wiring and behavior to thinking about the brain as an organ. It's a physical organ that has physical components and structures and other things. Changing its vasculature or changing the way the vasculature is separated from the brain is probably as important as just about anything else you could do that could contribute to its health. Here's another example from Etienne's experiment, looking at parvalbumin inhibitory neurons. Lots of them in a young animal, not so many in an old animal, recovered in their numbers, and to some extent recovered in their morphology in an old trained animal. So in fact, we've looked at more than 25 different, we or others, all of these haven't been on our list, of brain health that were restored to a youthful status by training. So how do you turn an older impaired or young impaired or old brain into a physically and functionally more capable or younger one? How do you keep it safer? You train it. Of course, it matters how you train it. We designed exercises specifically to try to achieve this kind of rejuvenation. This is a commercial. They're not the only exercise that would be effective. You should know that. So lots of other things that are out there have the right characteristics to be effective. So you should know that too. How do you turn a brain in the prime of life into an old one? Why did it go to hell? Turns out it's probably one of the easiest experiments we ever did. The experiment was led by Xiaoming Zhou. I might say Xiaoming Zhou did another important experiment. Xiaoming Zhou trained young animals in the prime of life using the same strategy that Etienne used to train animals near the end of life. And then he looked out towards the end of life. And he found that he could easily separate those animals as being healthy by every index by virtue of having been trained in the prime of life. So in other words, he drove changes in all of these dimensions. Again, all 17, or all of the things he did, he actually looked at 15 things. Everything he looked at was driven in an improving or strengthening direction, and that was retained so that the brain was very substantially different. He also looked beyond the cortex and the hippocampus and other places. They were also changed so that the brain looked like a younger brain in everything he looked at. There's a word for that. We call that word cognitive reserve, which these studies indicate is something that you can inject into a brain whenever you choose to. Young, old, who cares, right? Whenever you need it. You just add noise. So what does noise do? Well, after 4 or 5 weeks of noise, in a brain in the prime of life, the brain looks like it's about to die. And what noise does is it basically contributes to natural adjustments in the operational characteristics of the brain, because the brain can no longer sustain highly organized, temporally and spatially organized local activities. So it's moving right back on the trajectory in an aging direction, or you could say, because plasticity is reversible, it's moving right back from the prime of life towards the condition of the brain that applied at the beginning of life. So that's another way of saying that the same biological changes underlie both the transition from the beginning of life to that vigorous young adulthood, and training an old brain back to the prime of life to being more like a young brain. The nature of the transition is the same. Now that actually, from a practical point of view, is incredibly valuable and important for us to know, because it means to make a brain stronger, if it's impacted by things that happen early in life, it's not so different from making a brain stronger in improving the characteristic of its operations coming from an impaired position toward the end of life. And in fact, in almost any way the brain is struggling, these things are moving in a clastic direction. Brain health is going to hell, and the strategies for driving it correctly are not so different, I submit, in condition after condition after condition. And we know in clinical indications, there's another overlay of things that are happening that distinguish them. A depressed person is not exactly identical with a bipolar person, of course, or a bipolar person with a schizophrenic, or a schizophrenic with a person with an anxiety. They are different disorders. But there is an overlay behind them, a background, you could say, in which almost certainly there's a strong overlap of expressed plastic changes. And those changes, that aspect of the correction, that underlying improvement of general brain health, is probably a part of what we should always be doing, as we also derive these more sophisticated or specific changes that relate to that clinical indication. So we can throw the plasticity switch by this argument in a blastic or clastic direction at will, not to speak with, just not without too much exaggeration. In one direction, coordinated positive performance-enhancing organic brain health strategy strengthening changes. In another direction, coordinated negative performance-degrading organic brain health compromising changes. Now, why the hell do we have the capacity to move backward? And what accounts for that? Well, I think the machine is designed, obviously, to support survival. And survival is dependent upon getting the answer right. And in the face of noise, adjustments need to be made to get the answer right. So when you're out in the woods and you're looking across the meadow and you're saying, well, what is that I see? You know, and the conditions are poor, you say, oh, that's a deer, right? And it took you a while to get the answer right, because as noise grows, you know, then correct identification of the signal is prolonged. So basically, we change our operational characteristics to sustain control. Now, this is a fabulous thing. No matter what how noisy our operations are, however we've evolved in our own performance abilities, generally, we humans get the answer right. And we have a great deal of flexibility. You know, we could be really going to hell in old age, and yet we can generally get the answer right. And in a sense, sustain ourselves, feed ourselves, establish a level of control to maintain our independence. Doesn't mean that our brain is healthy. It's commonly not healthy. But it's sustaining us because it's flexible in this powerful way. So I think that's why we have this. Or to put it another way, when we're a baby, we come out of the noise, and the brain's task is to organize itself, refine itself in every detail, sort, and improve its refined processing, improve its local correlation, and all of it, map all of these things, associate all of these things, grow. Everything now at high resolution, at high speed, at every level. And then noise begins to slip into the process as we go from an intense learning phase to a largely automated using phase of life. Now, as users, we're not engaging the machinery to sustain our fidelity in every way. We're not practicing our violin enough. And as a consequence, we gradually go back where we came from, back towards a noisy situation. So in order to drive these changes, we've tried to create exercises. This is a little bit of a commercial called Brain HQ, but it's our own best attempt. And again, there's several other things that people have attempted to create have good value. I'm not just saying this is the only thing. But they're adaptive, they're optimized for rapid gains, they're targeted to recover key skills. We have an extensive array of things because you do need to have refined treatment of a lot of operations, and you really want to elaborate things, especially in higher level processes. We try to continuously validate outcomes in every exercise cycle, so we actually record behavioral performance about 40 times an hour. It's proven to work. We've supported many gold standard trials. There's more than 100 trials that are now underway out in the world. The clinically monitored via the internet and scalable, because it's very cheap. All you really need is an internet connection. Okay, so I want to talk about the application of this in a specific condition, and I want to use it as a platform, finally, to talk about managing brain health. So the application is to consider dealing with the universal disease in humankind, and that's the deterioration of function and aging. Now here's one index of the deterioration of the changes that occur in aging. Here we're looking at processing speed or perceptual speed. And so this is a simple index of performance in the brains as a function of age. And you can see that its peak performance at roughly 30th birthday, things begin to decline. They decline at about a third of a standard deviation per decade. So in other words, when you go from 30 to 60, you move at a standard deviation across the distribution. That's a big difference. And you can see the decline is relatively regular. It's a little bit different if we look at males and females, but basically everybody goes ultimately into the tank. And you could say down in this part of the distribution, you're at high risk for the onset of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Beyond your 85th birthday, about 40% of people fall into that class. So you're heading, in a sense, towards oblivion. And you can see if you look at a number of other measures, here's reasoning, spatial visualization, episodic memory, they're all coming down in parallel. They're all changing to about the same degree. People have argued that speed must be playing some contributing role to the maintenance of all of these conditions. Well, it might not be speed itself. What it might be is that with speed, the only way that you can sustain speed is by sustaining strong local correlation, coordination in activity. And that would be critical to almost every cognitive performance thing you want to measure. You need to be shipping forward information around in the brain with high reliability, you could say with strongly correlated and salient activities. So that might be really what is indexing that. You can see one function that is not fitting the others, And that's this function going up. And this is a placeholder for information. You're recording more and more as you get older. This is why we tolerate old people. Recording information, of course, takes time. And of course, this particular class of individuals reach a peak. I know everyone in this room that's older is still going up like a rocket, but that's another story. I seem to have a message over here that disappears almost before it appears. That's fabulous. Hey. Yeah. You read that, right? If you didn't read it, you should go to Brain HQ. It's only about $85, you know. Okay. So let me give you an example of a demonstration that you can recover an ability like this in an old brain. So here we're looking at a speeded multitasking related task. It's called double decision, and it's Posit science form of the UFOV task. It's used extensively in studies in aging. I'm going to talk a little bit about them in a minute. And basically what we're looking at here is a series of individuals that have been on this task, and we're looking at their performance when they start. And this is the performance as a function of age. And this is very much like the function we'd see in rats. And our simple task, you're good, down is good, you're good when you're young, and you get progressively poorer as you age, decade by decade. And you can see now we train everybody. Everybody's trained roughly an equivalent amount. And you can see in all of these matched cohorts, there's about an equivalent gain in ability, at least proportional gain. Everybody gains. The 90-year-olds, 80-year-olds gain. Everybody gains. And in fact, if you look at the performance ability of the trained 75-year-old, you see that their performance now matches the untrained 20-year-old. Now, I could show you 25 plots like this, and they're all the same. Now, you can take any elemental task like this. Now, what you should understand is that when you process information at speed, accuracy requires that the machinery of the brain be in a certain condition. We know how speeded processing is accounted for neurologically. So we know that going from a poor performance ability to a high performance ability or a higher performance ability must involve change in a whole series of physical chemical processes, right? So the fact that this person is now performing like an untrained 25-year-old or 20-year-old is really important, as it means that we index to change in brain health. You could say if humans are like rats and all of these things change together, that's unequivocally true. Because it means that the vasculature is improved, probably the blood-brain barrier is stronger, probably a whole bunch of other things are better, right? So it's important to know, and we don't know completely whether all these things are changing in a human, but we dream that they are. And if they are, then this is definitely foretelling broad positive changes in brain health, because brain speed measures provide an important indicator of both the brain's performance abilities and its organic health status. Performance gains in attention and speed must arise from a coordinated series of brain's rejuvenated physical changes. So how does noise grow in the older brain? Well, it grows in the older brain because largely of how we live our modern lives and maybe lives in general, but we're not out there scrambling in the way we were scrambling naturally. I mean, we'd spend all this time looking at screens, sitting on our butt, looking up the way to everything. We're not masters of our environment. We look up the answer to every damn thing. We're just absolutely focused to this thing. We pave even the path in the park, for God's sake. Clearly we're contributing in a modern lifestyle to this progressive deterioration. Probably the main source of it is that in a modern life, we go from a period of active development of our skills and abilities to the mastery of things, to the level of initiation of our professional life, and the start of our family. Really, that's shocking. I've used too much time. That's just amazing. To a period in life where things are more automatic, and we're sliding into that era Dr. Jackson talked about, where we're unfortunately becoming just a little bit too routinized in everything we do, and we're becoming, you could say, the hardened older person, like I am. I'm going to kill myself here. So it turns out hundreds of other vicissitudes across the course of a life also contribute to noisiness in brain processes. I just listed 50 here, but you could list, another 50 in which you could argue that studies have shown in one way or another that the passage to dementia is accelerated by something in your environment or something that happens to you. And all of those things are hypothetically almost certainly contributing in a direct or indirect way to the increase of the noisiness of the processes of the brain. But fortunately, you know that we can throw the plasticity switch back in a growth direction. So like your physical body, your brain obviously needs exercise to sustain high-function organic health. And we know that resilience or cognitive reserve stemming from active brain use differentiates the healthy from the unhealthy brain. So one of the really interesting things about the pathology of a disease like Alzheimer's disease is that the pathology doesn't account for the disease. It accounts for about 40% of the variation in performance abilities that relates to whether people can sustain their independence in old age. The rest of it is accounted for by cognitive reserve. Cognitive reserve is resilience that somehow comes from how you live your life. And I submit that cognitive reserve is not too complicated. Cognitive reserve is all about sustaining your brain's operation at high fidelity, at speed. And that anybody can get some at any point. It's easy to inject in the brain. We know that we can prevent all of this stuff if we maintain these things in a physical state. We've extensively studied the basis of that reserve, and we think that forms of exercise, I say brain HQ, but you should really say these forms of exercise are an aspect of the answer. Now, I finally want to say that we know this works in part from beautiful studies that were led in part by Gerry Edwards, who's here in the audience, a wonderful scientist at University of South Florida in Tampa. And she, with her mentor, Carleen Ball, who's at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, are among a number of scientists that contributed a critical aspect of training study to what's called the active study, which was conducted about 13, 14, 15 years ago. Over a period of 10 years, individuals were trained in this active study using a task that had a lot of the elements that I'm talking about and that would restore brain health. And as a consequence of that training for 10 hours, or actually they trained up to 18 hours, but initial training was 10 hours, followed by a year later in some subjects, 2 to 4 more hours, and then 2 years later in some subjects, 2 to 4 more hours, those same subjects. So half the people were trained for a total of 14 to 18 hours, the other for just 10 hours in the first year. All the training was over in year 3. Then they tracked them forward 7 more years. That's basic study. What they saw was half as many traffic accidents in these initial periods of the trial for a substantial period across the epoch of the trial, far safer driving, reliably sustained driver mobility, more confident, effective driving. They saw improvements of everyday functional abilities. This is Fred Walensky from Iowa. These are 2 Iowa scientists that have contributed in a different way to contemporary studies. Fred has done many of these studies. In a statistical analysis, improvements of everyday functional abilities, protection against senior depression, better sustained independence, better health, better quality of life, less everyday functional difficulty across 10 years. Now, all of this came from working on a computer in a visual exercise that was driving improvements of resolution in time and in place. That's all they did, right? One mode, just in time and place. And the final outcome that was recorded was 28 to 48% reduction in dementia incidence. At the end of 10 years, lots more people that didn't do this developed dementia than people that did do it. So clearly, I would say, some resilience had been injected in these people, and the consequence of that was protective. And you'd say, well, what if they had actually maintained, driven the performance abilities in speed and accuracy to a performance level that always drove the brain to a youthful level reliably and kept it there? What if they had sustained that from the time they were 30? What if they'd never let it slide? What if they'd actually paid attention to the health of their brain? What a concept. Why aren't we doing that? Why in our medical practice do we not understand that brain health should be continually monitored and managed? Why aren't we looking at every psychiatric illness as preventable? Why aren't we doing that? Well, not every. trauma can occur. We can't stop that. But so much of what we see and treat psychiatrically is preventable. Why can't we try to understand what is the forerunner of ALS? Or what is the forerunner of Parkinson's disease? Or what is the forerunner of Alzheimer's disease? And stop it. That's clearly where medicine should go. We should rethink. The sooner the better. And it's wonderful to see that I can see that happening here. This is exactly the kind of place. I think this place is going to be, I've talked to so many smart people here. This could be a leader in the world for driving this science into medicine and into the world. So all I got to say about that is, damn it, go faster. That last part, those last slides, by the way, that was a really important information.
Well, Mike, I've seen many of your talks. I think this was a special tour de force. So we're all going to go faster. But we have time for a few questions before we will have Sean to talk.
Great talk. Thank you very much. So if there's one take home, it says that, the brain is plastic and everything changes and such. But I'm curious to what you think about things that are relatively stable over the lifetime. So genotype, for one, being a thing that doesn't change.
Right.
And of course, gene expression changes over the lifetime. But, for some disorders that have relatively complex genetics and stuff, ADHD, schizophrenia, and such, I wonder if you expect certain brains to be sort of burn in plasticity or difficult to change?
Right, it's a great question, and we know from Sophia's studies in schizophrenia that some people are relatively strongly impacted by forms of training that she's applied, and other people are more resistant. And we know that this relates in some ways to their genetic distinctions, that they're not genetically identical, of course, and this is also always in play. To my mind, every brain is plastic. I mean, every brain that sort of grew up and is not completely out of control. I mean, there are individuals in which the plasticity machine itself was directly affected. Rett syndrome is one that Mike talked about. Some forms of autism are like this, in which it's clearly the plasticity machinery itself is substantially affected. But in most conditions, the brain is plastic, ready to change, and part of the issue is to try to sort out how to deal with changing it in the face of the genetics. And we know that in almost all of these conditions, schizophrenia, as an example, if you have an identical twin, show me even a genetically identified version, or you could say pattern, in which the identical twin cannot be free from schizophrenia. Because commonly what we see in these conditions, autism, identical twin, 30–40% of them are going to be mildly or not autistic, right? So what protected them? So something in their gene expression protected them, and probably that comes in some way out of their very early life. And if we just could understand how to control that, one of the things I think is that conceivably a lot of these things, if we just understood this enough, could be controlled in infancy. We could know what we need to do to move things so that they're moving in the right direction and ultimately not going to lead to 20 years later to this disaster. I'm making this up. But of course, we have to always consider the genetics. And then there are things, undoubtedly, that because the inherited problem does affect something like plasticity itself, that can be particularly difficult for us to deal with or correct.
So I want to ask about some of the actual data that you put up, because the data did not seem to show an interaction between age and training. And that implies to me that you're not actually fixing a problem and restoring the old people to 20-year-olds, but rather doing an overall improvement. So, for example, in that example where you were saying that you improved the old person down to the 20-year-old, the 20-year-olds were improving by exactly the same amount.
Yeah, what we think we're doing is to the contrary, because we can see this dynamically. is we think we're upregulating the modulatory control that's controlling learning rate. And it actually very quickly, the brain is as good a learner or fastest learner. And we've been doing experiments in which we've basically been studying the modulation of learning rate. So, and now what we commonly are doing is we're actually driving the recovery of the modulatory control machinery, and we, by different measures, we know that we're accomplishing that. Then we drive the learning, and we see that what we do when we do that is we accelerate the learning rate and we drive the brain to a higher asymptote.
So is there...
But that's a fair question, and I can't really answer more than that.
Well, but a quick follow-up to that. Does that imply, I mean, is there a maximum? If you look at a distribution of 20-year-olds, for example, are there 20-year-olds that are not improvable by this system?
That's a hard question to answer, but there are 20-year-olds that improve a lot and 20-year-olds that improve less. And you can drive it to an asymptote. So one of the questions that we've asked is, in a limited way, is if we drove an old person, farther and farther, how close could they get to a trained 20-year-old, you could say? Could they ever catch up? We've done this in the practical realm. For example, we trained people that are trading commodities on an exchange where speed is of the essence. And one of the goals of doing that was to see if you could train the 30-year-old be as fast as the 20-year-old. And it turns out you can do that. But if you train both of them together, the 30-year-old will never be as fast as the 20-year-old, because the 20-year-old will go to a higher asymptote. So there is some loss. There is absolutely some loss. So if you carry this to an asymptotic performance level, ultimately you'll have a superior 20-year-old and you'll have a lot better 80-year-old, but not to the level of the trained 20-year-old ever. Well, I shouldn't say ever. I would say rarely.
Mike, thank you very much for your talk. This is Angus McDonald. I'm back here. I wanted to bring in a question about generalization and some of the problems that this area has faced. And in particular, I'd like you to, you portray this as a switch that we switch on and off. You do have some cautious language about if you do it in the correct way and so forth, but there's so many things, there's such a large system that's being affected, it suggests that there may be a number of routes into this. And yet at the same time, you've got the Nature report a few years back, a very large powered study amongst healthy individuals, a fair dose that was given of brain training in that study. There wasn't change. Luminosity, of course, was taken to court by the FTC for false claims about being able to stave off age-related decline. And it seems like where things hit the skids is you can train stuff, you can get better at stuff. Then you ask people to do something new, and there hasn't been much change. So how does your data reflect on that? What have you done to guard against it? What have you done to promote generalization? Or is generalization, do you think, oversold as a desiderata from brain training?
Well, it's a complicated question, but let me just say a few things about it. First of all, lumosity. Lumosity was called on the carpet not so much because what they do is valueless. What they do almost certainly has some value. Were called on the carpet because they hadn't demonstrated it had value, right? They did not measure or document it. So they could have done that, and presumably they would have done that. They would have seen some value. But I'm not trying to defend lumosity, believe me. Okay, but if you think about what happened in the active trial. So the active trial, people were trained for a abbreviated period of time, and then you look later and you see that there are all of these improvements of an everyday complex behavior called driving. But it's beyond driving. They keep their driver's license, they're out there, they're sustaining independence, all these secondary consequences of that. You look at their performance on an everyday task, how long in a timed activity of daily living, they're faster. And you say, well, of course that relates to the training. In what sense is that generalization? Well, sure as hell is extending it in that domain. You could say it sure is generally in a near transfer sense to a real activity that's really important to the person. And it ultimately extends to reduction of the time of onset to dementia. You can't count, does that count it as generalization? Or should we say dismissively, that doesn't matter. That's not generalization. Let's not do this. Obviously, it was a very, very good thing. In fact, I submit, those people did not spend a better 10 to 18 hours in their life doing anything else. That was the most fortuitous 10 to 18 hours they ever spent on their time on the planet. So that's one answer. Second thing is that in study after study, of course, we look for generalization. We're trying to say, is this extend, we're training primarily on this level, and does this extend to non-trained things? Within the domain, you could say in near transfer or beyond it, too far transfer. And we almost always see measured, significant, generalized effects. And then finally, is it reasonable to think, well, first of all, when you measure generalization, we're bound up in the sort of domain of the psychologist. Psychologists measure certain things, right? You say, well, let's make this list of things and let's look at them that relates to whether or not this person has better, let's say, cognitive control. We'll look at these 2 or 3 things. I submit that if I change the speed of operations and the fidelity of operations of a brain at every level, and someone says that it doesn't have general value, they can just go straight to hell. So other than that, I have no strong opinion about it.
So I had a question, maybe taking this to the extreme, but in preparing some of these tasks and perhaps doing some of the rodent studies, have you ever seen that the training actually can produce, dysplasticity?
Oh, yeah, sure.
And so under what conditions should we try and avoid that?
Follow a Hebbian rule. Go south. It's easy to go south. No, it's easy. No, I could destroy your abilities. I could destroy your ability to understand what I say by training you, of course. You can destroy the detailed representation or a function or movement control or anything else you want by training. So you have to be sensitive of understanding the rules that apply. The rules are known on a first level, so you got to be careful about it. But we use plasticity to train a monkey to turn the hand into a claw. It's easy to do. All you have to do is to generate coincident input activity into the hand that de-differentiates. It's easy to differentiate it. You can take a cortical column and amplify its neuronal membership by 1,000-fold, easily. And now the whole area for a fingertip is totally unresolved. Monkey can't tell whether it's here, can't tell. Well, of course, you can turn around that training, and you can redifferentiate it, and you can give the monkey a super discriminative capacity that's like a fovea. Plasticity follows rules that are known, and we know the rules. So when you think whoever is applying this should understand this neuroscience. They should understand how to translate useful change into useful neurological change. One of the problems we have in all of this is that we've been dominated by empirical psychology. And one of the things that's changed, and it's wonderful happening here, this is psychology. First of all, that's fabulous science. The way psychological understanding has evolved is just tremendous. But marrying it with neuroscience, that's part of the revolution. Actually understanding all of these things in terms of neuronal process rules, that's the key.
I think that's a good stopping point and a good introduction to our last talk of the morning for the Science of Cognitive Training Institute, because really what Mike has raised for us is the challenge to take this neuroscience and translate it now into therapeutic approaches that are going to help human beings. And in order to do that, we need to design studies in human beings that allow us to test hypotheses related to these principles into generating adaptive changes via these plasticity mechanisms, and then look at the clinical and functional usefulness of such changes. And one of the things that's been an issue in the field and that has plagued us, and I would say, Angus, that's in addition to some of these sort of, poorly conducted sort of negative studies that have been out there, is that there have been poorly conducted clinical trials or trial types that have been out there, both underpowered, not thoughtful in their design, and so forth. And that also has plagued the field in terms of being accepted as kind of a respected contribution of a body of work to medicine. So Sean is going to talk to us about some...
You have been